Welcome to the Stories for Sleep channel. Here, we delve into the past to help you fall asleep easily and with a clear mind. Do not forget to subscribe and like this video immediately, as by the end of this lecture, you will be sound asleep. Close your eyes. The story is already beginning. The name Nostradamus is familiar to almost everyone. Even those who have never opened his books or read his cryptic quatrains have still heard the name as a symbol of prophecy, a sign of a foreseen future. In newspapers and magazines, on television, and across the internet, the words ring out again and again. Nostradamus also spoke of this. His verses are cited before wars and revolutions, before epidemics and disasters, when humanity feels an especially acute sense of anxiety about tomorrow. But who is he really? A mysterious prophet to whom the future was revealed, or a man of the Renaissance, a doctor and astrologer who possessed not a mystical gift, but an ability to discern the fears and moods of his time? Why do lines written almost 5 centuries ago still capture the imagination of millions of people? There are two sides to the image of Nostradamus. The first is the legend, created by time and countless interpreters. According to this legend, he predicted the deaths of French kings, world wars, revolutions, the rise of Hitler, the fall of the Twin Towers in New York, and even the epidemics of the 21st century. The second side is the real person who lived in 16th century France amidst the plague, religious wars, and the Inquisition. His texts are full of allusions, anagrams, metaphors, and vague descriptions. It is precisely because of this mysteriousness that they can be easily adapted to any event. Therefore, throughout this lecture, we will return to the central question: was Nostradamus a prophet who was granted access to the secrets of the future, or was he a writer and observer who so skillfully chose his words that they became timeless? This lecture is not only a story about his life, but also an attempt to understand why, 500 years later, we are still opening his quatrains, searching for answers, and finding a reflection of our own fears and hopes. A world of turmoil. 16th century France. To understand Nostradamus, we must go back to 16th century France. Today, we see it as a country of the Renaissance, a time of artists, poets, and the discovery of new lands and books. But for the people of that time, the world was full of anxiety and fear. Europe had just endured the Middle Ages. Although new ideas about science and art were gradually penetrating everyday life, daily existence remained harsh. The main scourge was the plague, called the Black Death. It came in waves and claimed tens of thousands of lives. Imagine a city with narrow streets and stone houses, where entire neighborhoods would be wiped out in just a few weeks. The air was filled with the smell of smoke from bonfires where infected items were burned, the ringing of funeral bells, and mournful cries. The disease afflicted both the rich and the poor, and it often seemed impossible to escape it. Doctors were powerless, and people saw these epidemics as punishment from the heavens. People prayed, wore amulets, and went on pilgrimages, but these measures rarely helped. To these woes were added wars. France was torn apart by internal conflicts. Religious strife between Catholics and Huguenots would soon erupt into bloody clashes, massacres, and a decade of instability. The fires of the Inquisition were a constant reminder that any thought deviating from dogma could cost a person their life. All of this was compounded by the widespread fear of the end of the world that was common in that era. People believed in prophecies, in celestial omens, in comets and blood moons. Each new cataclysm was perceived as a sign of the end times drawing near. It was into this world that Michel de Nostradamus, the future Nostradamus, was born in 1503. His birthplace was the small town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence in the south of France, amidst vineyards and ancient streets. His family was of Jewish descent who had converted to Christianity to avoid persecution. This was not uncommon at the time. Survival often demanded such flexibility, and faith sometimes became a matter of survival. Michel's father was a notary, a respected man, and the family was not poor. From a young age, the boy showed a talent for the sciences. He was interested not only in languages and literature, but also in medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. As a teenager, he began his studies in Avignon and later enrolled at the University of Montpellier, one of Europe's leading centers for medical education. There, he was introduced to the most advanced ideas of the time. A doctor's education then included not only pharmacology and surgery, but also astrology, as it was believed that the stars and planets directly influenced human health. To make a diagnosis or prescribe treatment, one had to consider a person's birth date and the position of celestial bodies. After graduation, Nostradamus began practicing as a doctor. He traveled extensively, helping in the fight against plague epidemics. His approach was unusual. Unlike many of his colleagues who relied on prayers or primitive remedies, he advised simple and practical measures. He spoke of the need to air out houses, avoid dirty water, wash hands thoroughly, and change clothes and bedding. For his time, this seemed almost revolutionary. Of course, he could not have known about microbes, but his observations that cleanliness and fresh air helped save lives. It was during these years that he earned a reputation not only as a doctor, but also as a brave man. While many fled plague-ridden cities, he remained with the sick. Although not all his methods were successful, people saw in him a man willing to sacrifice himself. But fate dealt him a cruel blow. While he was away helping the inhabitants of other towns, the plague came to his home. His first wife and 2 children died from the disease. Nostradamus could not save them. This tragedy broke him for many years. It is believed that it was after this event that he began to travel extensively, study ancient texts, and delve into alchemy, astrology, and mystical teachings. His wanderings lasted several years. He worked as a doctor, but at the same time, he was searching for something more than just knowledge of herbs and medicines. He read books by ancient authors, the works of medieval astrologers, and biblical interpretations. The idea of predicting the future, of being able to peer beyond the veil of time, increasingly attracted him. Eventually, he settled in Salon-de-Provence. Here, he remarried. He had a family again, and his life took on a sense of relative peace. He continued to treat people, wrote medical books and almanacs, and compiled astrological forecasts. He was respected as both a doctor and a scholar. But it was during these years that he began to work on what would bring him immortality, the collection of quatrains known as the Centuries, the birth of a prophetic writer. When Nostradamus lost his family and saw the powerlessness of medicine against the plague, his life changed. He could no longer be just a doctor. A new desire emerged within him to understand not just the human body, but the entire order of the universe. He began to ask questions. Why is the world arranged so that calamities come one after another? Why are human fates so tragic and often predetermined? Is it possible to know in advance what the future holds? He sought answers in astrology. To a modern person, astrology is often seen as an amusement, but in the 16th century, it was a serious science recognized by universities. Doctors and scholars sincerely believed that the positions of the planets influenced character, diseases, crop yields, and even the destinies of entire nations. The world was considered a giant system where celestial bodies governed earthly processes. Nostradamus worked extensively with astrological tables. He studied ancient treatises, including the works of Ptolemy and Arab scholars, which were especially popular in Europe after their translation from Arabic into Latin. He prepared horoscopes for patients and clients, and gradually began to expand the scope of his predictions. Now he was interested not only in health and disease, but also in future events, wars, dynastic marriages, and the fate of royal houses. This is how he began to publish almanacs. These almanacs were a great success. They contained weather forecasts, crop predictions, advice for peasants and artisans, as well as astrological forecasts for important events. Nostradamus hinted at future disasters or prosperous years in them. His almanacs were distributed throughout France, and his name became recognizable far beyond Provence. But at the same time, he understood the danger. In France, the power of the Inquisition was strong, and any prophecy, especially one related to religion or the fate of rulers, could be considered heresy. A single reckless word could cost him his freedom or even his life. Prophecies always balance between popularity and risk. Nostradamus saw how other thinkers were accused of witchcraft. He knew he had to be cautious. So he found a clever way. He decided that his prophecies must be written in a way that they could not be understood immediately, so that anyone who opened his books would see not a direct text, but a riddle. Thus was born his special style, the language of the quatrains. Quatrains are 4-line verses. They were written in a mixture of French, Latin, and Occitan, sometimes with elements of Italian. This colorful language created an atmosphere of mystery and at the same time protected the author. If a censor or a church official read such a text, they would not be able to find a direct accusation of heresy or a threat to rulers. It all looked like obscure poetry. Nostradamus also used anagrams, rearranging letters in names and words. For example, instead of a name, he might encrypt a set of letters that only vaguely resembled the original word. Sometimes he resorted to symbols. The sun could mean a king, the moon the people, a comet war, a river a country. This language was constructed so that it could be interpreted in different ways. This was the genius of Nostradamus. He understood that an exact prediction was impossible, but if the text was written ambiguously enough, people would see in it what they wanted to see. And when an event happened, they would remember his quatrain and say, he knew in advance. This method was not only a form of protection, but also a strategy. On the one hand, it shielded him from accusations of witchcraft. On the other, it made his texts universal. A prophecy written in the middle of the 16th century could be applied to events 100 or even 500 years later. This is the reason why Nostradamus is still read today. Over time, he wrote less about medicine and devoted more time to his predictions. His notebooks filled with quatrains full of dark images and illusions. At night, he would sit by candlelight in his home in Salon de Provence, gazing at the stars and putting mysterious lines on paper. His neighbors and contemporaries saw in him an astrologer and a sage. He began to be invited to the courts of the nobility, and soon even the Queen of France, Catherine de' Medici, took an interest in him. Nostradamus was gradually becoming not only a doctor and astrologer, but a prophet, around whose name an aura of mystery was born. And he consciously maintained this aura. His language, his caution, and his ambiguity made his quatrains not just texts, but an eternal riddle that people would try to solve again and again. The centuries, structure, and symbolism. When Nostradamus began creating his main book, he was already known as a doctor and an astrologer, but it was the centuries that transformed him into a figure of legendary stature. It was his most ambitious work. In it, he decided to gather all his observations and predictions, put them into poetic form, and leave them for posterity. The name centuries is symbolic in itself. It comes from the Latin word centuria, meaning 100. The concept was grandiose: 10 collections, each with 100 quatrains, for a total of 1,000 verses that were meant to form a complete prophetic work. In reality, however, the work remained unfinished. Some collections were not completed, and the final number of quatrains was less than 1,000. But this incompleteness only intensified the aura of mystery. It was believed that some prophecies might have been lost or deliberately hidden. The form of the quatrain was not chosen by accident, for lines are concise, compact, and easy to memorize. This structure allowed for thoughts to be cloaked in a poetic image, where not only every word, but also the sound, rhythm, and pause carried meaning. The quatrains were like riddles or ciphers that demanded interpretation, and this is what created the aura of prophecy around them. People are always drawn to solving what is hidden. The language of the centuries was special. Nostradamus wrote in a mixture of Old French and Occitan, sometimes adding Latin and Italian words. For his contemporaries, his language was difficult, and for later generations, it was almost incomprehensible. The same word could have several meanings, and unusual turns of phrase opened up a wide field for interpretation. As a result, every reader found in these texts what they wanted to see. This characteristic made the quatrains universal. They could be adapted to different eras and events. Nostradamus did not limit himself to just language games. He skillfully wove images borrowed from antiquity into his quatrains. He was well-versed in the history and mythology of Greece and Rome, and so he often described contemporary events by drawing parallels to ancient times. He compared rulers to Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great, battles to those of antiquity, and disasters to mythological catastrophes. This gave his prophecies a special depth. People perceived them as part of a great historical tradition, where the past and the present were connected in a single pattern. Biblical images were no less significant. The breath of the apocalypse is constantly felt in Nostradamus's quatrains. Blood, fire, ruined cities, the fall of rulers, celestial omens, all of this is reminiscent of the lines from the Book of Revelation. For the people of the 16th century, living amidst constant wars and plague, such images seemed particularly relevant. They felt that Nostradamus's prophecies were a direct continuation of the biblical visions of the end times. For example, when he wrote about a great fire that would engulf a city in the year of the number 66, many of his contemporaries perceived this as a hint of the number of the beast from the apocalypse. And when, a century later, the Great Fire of London actually occurred in 1666, Nostradamus's quatrain was recalled and declared a direct prediction. The centuries were constructed so that each quatrain was a separate fragment, yet together they created a mosaic. Nostradamus did not write a connected narrative. He offered a collection of images and visions. This made the book like a kaleidoscope. One had to search for meaning by comparing different quatrains, trying to grasp the thread of events. It is also interesting that there are almost no direct references to specific dates or names in the centuries. Instead, Nostradamus used allusions. Sometimes these were anagrams, rearranged letters that only vaguely resembled the real name. Sometimes they were symbols. The sun meant power or a monarch, the moon the people or changeability, a comet a disaster, and blood war. This language was both poetic and convenient for concealing the true meaning. Contemporaries saw the centuries as a book in which the future was encoded. Many read it as a kind of continuation of the Holy Scriptures. Although the Church did not officially recognize Nostradamus's prophecies, his texts were spread through manuscripts, discussed in a small circle, and at the same time became a subject of curiosity for the nobility. The very form of the book and the structure of the 1000s gave it an aura of completeness, as if it were not just the work of one man, but a message addressed to all of humanity. Thus, the centuries became a unique phenomenon. They were neither scientific forecasts nor mystical revelations in the direct sense. They were a blend of poetry, astrology, ancient and biblical images, personal observations, and popular fears. This was the book's power. It spoke to people in their own language, combining familiar symbols into a mysterious and unsettling picture of the future. France and its kings. The legend begins. Among all the quatrains written by Nostradamus, those concerning France hold a special place. This is not surprising. He was French, lived amidst the anxieties and misfortunes of his country, and its destiny troubled him most of all. 16th century France was the time of the House of Valois kings, who ruled amid constant wars, crises, and rising religious strife. The people lived in anxiety, in expectation of catastrophe, and Nostradamus's prophecies fell on this fertile ground like seeds on a plowed field. Even during his lifetime, he became famous for quatrains in which people saw hints of the fall of kings. The main example was the case of King Henry II. The king was an energetic man who loved hunting, feasts, and tournaments. Despite his age and position, he enthusiastically participated in jousting. Tournaments at the French court were not just entertainment, they were a symbol of the monarch's strength and honor, a way to show the people that the king was not afraid of risk and knew how to handle a weapon. In June 1559, a grand festival was organized in Paris. The event had a dual significance. First, it celebrated the wedding of Henry's daughter, Elizabeth of Valois, to the Spanish Prince Philip, and second, it marked the peace treaty with Spain. To celebrate, a jousting tournament was held. The atmosphere was festive. People were happy that the war was over. The king himself decided to participate in a duel, and this decision proved to be fatal. Henry's opponent was Gabriel de Lorges, Count de Montgomery, the commander of the king's personal guard. The first match ended without incident, but Henry, wanting to test his strength once more, insisted on a rematch. That is when the tragedy happened. Montgomery's lance struck the king's helmet visor, and fragments went into his eye, causing a deep wound. Henry suffered for several days, but doctors could not save him. Now let us look at the quatrain that is associated with this event. The young lion will overcome the old one on the field of battle in a single combat, in a golden cage. He will gouge out his eye, 2 wounds in one, and he will die a cruel death. Every word of this quatrain seemed astonishingly accurate. Henry was indeed older than Montgomery, and their encounter can be called single combat. The king's helmet, adorned with gold, perfectly fit the image of a golden cage. And the most terrible coincidence was the eye wound, which proved to be fatal. Contemporaries were shocked. For many, this was the ultimate proof of Nostradamus's prophetic gift. Catherine de' Medici, the widow of Henry II, became even more interested in the astrologer. She invited him to court and made him a court seer. From that moment, his fame spread throughout Europe. This quatrain is still considered one of the most convincing examples of a prophecy. Skeptics, of course, note that the lion image was a common symbol, and duels in golden helmets were not a rarity among the nobility, but the coincidence is still so striking that it solidified Nostradamus's reputation. However, not only the fate of Henry II was linked to the quatrains. The centuries also contain other lines that interpreters have connected to French kings. Nostradamus wrote that the French crown would be covered in blood many times, that the throne would be threatened, and that the country would be torn apart by internal strife. These lines found a reflection in the terrible events that soon descended upon France. After the death of Henry II, the country plunged into the chaos of the wars of religion. Catholics and Huguenots feuded, causing massacres and rebellions. Paris and other cities became arenas of bloody clashes. In Nostradamus's quatrains, one can find images of fire in great cities, rivers of blood, and a schism that will devour France. These words were taken literally when people witnessed the horrors firsthand. The quatrains made an especially strong impression during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. On the orders of the royal court, a mass slaughter of Huguenots was organized. Thousands of people were killed in Paris and throughout France. Blood literally ran in the streets, bonfires burned, and the rift between Catholics and Protestants became irreconcilable. Contemporaries once again opened Nostradamus's book and found confirmation that he had foreseen everything. The quatrain about the death of Henry II was the starting point, after which Nostradamus's name became a symbol of prophecy. But the images describing the bloody turmoil and schism in France only strengthened his authority. To the people of that time, he was no longer just a doctor or an astrologer. He became a prophet who warned of disasters. And each new calamity seemed to be a confirmation of his words. Thus, the quatrains about France became the earliest and most striking proof of Nostradamus's prophetic power. His lines combined a precise coincidence, as in the case of Henry II's death, with general pictures of disaster that were easily superimposed on the events of the religious wars. In the eyes of his contemporaries, this made his prophecies unquestionable and him a nearly biblical prophet among his people. The great conquerors, from Napoleon to Hitler. Among Nostradamus's prophecies, those linked to great conquerors hold a special place. His contemporaries sought hints about the fate of France in these lines, but later, after Europe experienced the era of Napoleon and the horrors of World War II, these prophecies became the most famous and most frequently cited. The first example is the quatrain about Napoleon. It contains a strange set of words, Pau ne Laurent. To a person of the 16th century, this seemed like a list of towns, and indeed, there are towns named Pau and Ney in southern France, and Laurent could be derived from a local place name. However, later, in the 19th century, when Europe witnessed the rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, these words were read differently. Interpreters noticed that if read together, they sounded like Napoleon. The quatrain itself describes a man of humble origin who will rise through wars and whose fame will spread throughout Europe. One must agree that this image matches Napoleon's fate. He was born on Corsica, far from Paris, into a modest family, but thanks to his military talent and determination, he managed to become the first consul and then the Emperor of France. His campaigns covered almost all of Europe, from Spain to Russia. Supporters of Nostradamus say, the coincidence is striking. The name is hidden in the text, and the fate is described quite accurately. But skeptics object. The words Pau, Ney, Laurent are real place names, and there is no certainty that Nostradamus meant Napoleon. Moreover, the quatrains are written so vaguely that the description of a man of humble origin who became great through wars could fit not only Napoleon, but dozens of other conquerors. Nevertheless, it was in the 19th century that this quatrain became a classic. When Europe was ablaze with the Napoleonic Wars, people opened the centuries and found confirmation there. For believers in prophecy, it was proof that Napoleon's fate was predetermined. An even more controversial quatrain is one linked to the name Hitler. It contains the word Hister. At first glance, the difference from the dictator's last name is minimal, just one letter. The text speaks of a great leader who will come from the depths of Europe, whose power will spread to the east, and whose peoples will be in terror. When millions of people faced the cruelty of the Nazi regime during World War II, Nostradamus's lines resonated with new power. It seemed that he had directly named the man who became the embodiment of evil in the 20th century. Newspapers printed these prophecies, films and broadcasts quoted the quatrains, and the Allies even used them for propaganda purposes, claiming that Hitler's downfall was foretold. But here, too, there is a point of contention. Hister is the Latin name for the Danube, a great river in Central Europe. In ancient sources, this word was used to refer to the region along the Danube. Thus, Nostradamus may not have been speaking of a man named Hitler at all, but of some danger that would come from those lands. And only later, when the world learned the name of the German dictator, was a prediction seen in the text. Skeptics argue, We see in the quatrains what we want to see. If the figure of Hitler had not existed, no one would have associated the word Hister with the name. But after the war, the coincidence became too striking and faith in the prophecy grew stronger. In both the case of Napoleon and the case of Hitler, we face the same issue. Nostradamus's prophecies are written so vaguely and ambiguously that they can be interpreted in dozens of ways. When great events occur, people open the book and find lines that seem to be a coincidence. But this coincidence is born from the ambiguity of the text. At the same time, it is impossible not to admit that it was these very quatrains that made Nostradamus a legend. If he had only written about weather or crop yields, he would have been long forgotten. But the quatrains that seemed to foretell the fates of Napoleon and Hitler became symbols of his foresight. They gave his name weight and made his prophecies an eternal riddle. And the question remains, over which historians, philologists, and mystics still argue: did Nostradamus really foresee the coming of these men, or did we, in hindsight, fit his words to the events? Was he a prophet to whom the future was revealed, or merely a poet who so skillfully used words that he was able to create texts suitable for any era? This question has no clear answer, but it is precisely what has kept interest in Nostradamus alive for centuries. Every time the world faces a new threat or a great upheaval, people open his book once again and search for familiar words, new allusions, and new coincidences. Disasters and the human psyche. Disasters have always held a significant place in Nostradamus's prophecies. His contemporaries lived in a world where calamities were a part of everyday life. Fires destroyed cities, epidemics wiped out entire generations, the earth shook, and rivers overflowed their banks. For a person of the 16th century, all of this seemed like signs of heavenly wrath and harbingers of the end times. Therefore, it is not surprising that the centuries contain so many lines about destruction, blood, and suffering. The most famous example of such a prophecy is the quatrain linked to the Great Fire of London in 1666. It speaks of a city of great fire and mentions the number 66. These words seemed vague to Nostradamus's contemporaries, but after the tragedy that occurred more than a century later, they sounded like a revelation. On the night of September 2nd, 1666, a bakery on Pudding Lane in London caught fire. Due to dry weather and strong winds, the fire spread quickly. Within 3 days, almost the entire central part of the city burned down. More than 13,000 houses and nearly 90 churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral, were destroyed. Thousands of people were left homeless. The city lay in ruins. When the flames subsided and the damage was being assessed, someone remembered Nostradamus's lines. The city of great fire and the number 66 seemed to be an obvious reference to this very fire. Many believed that the prophecy had been fulfilled precisely. However, here too there are doubts. Nostradamus's quatrains contain many images of fire and the destruction of cities. The mention of the number 66 can be interpreted in different ways. It could be 1566, or simply a symbolic representation of the number of the beast from the apocalypse. But in the public consciousness, the coincidence was so striking that from that moment on, the prophecies about disasters became firmly ingrained in the legend of Nostradamus. Quatrains where he speaks of earthquakes and floods are no less interesting. The earth shaking underfoot, ruined cities, rivers overflowing their banks, all these images appear constantly in his lines. For centuries, interpreters have found in these images references to specific tragedies. Nostradamus was recalled especially often after the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. It was one of the most terrible disasters of the 18th century. The massive tremors destroyed the city. A tsunami followed, and then fires. Tens of thousands of people died. The whole world was shaken by this catastrophe. And again, people opened the centuries and saw lines about a city by the sea that would be destroyed by fire and water. For believers in the prophecy, this was a direct reference to Lisbon. The same logic was applied to other earthquakes. Every major disaster, whether in Italy, Turkey, or elsewhere, found its prophecy in Nostradamus because the images were general enough: water, fire, earth, blood. They could be applied to any event. Similarly, the lines about floods worked. When rivers overflowed their banks and destroyed homes, when storms swept away entire villages, people would again open the book of prophecies and find confirmation in it. But perhaps the most personal topic for Nostradamus himself was epidemics. He knew their horror firsthand. In his youth, he lost his wife and children to the plague. For decades, he fought this disease, risking his life to help the sick and developing his own methods of treatment. And so, the themes of disease and the Black Death are especially common in his quatrains. He wrote about new calamities that would come from the east, about nations dying by the thousands, about a great illness that would engulf the earth. These lines became particularly relevant every time Europe faced epidemics. In the 16th century, during new waves of plague, the quatrains were read and seen as predictions. In the 19th century, when the world learned of cholera, they were opened again. In the early 20th century, during the Spanish flu, people found confirmation in them. And even in our own time, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Nostradamus's lines resurfaced in newspapers and on the internet. People found words about a new illness that would come from Asia and engulf the entire world. These examples show the main point. Nostradamus's quatrains are not rigidly tied to one event. They are written in such a way that they always remain relevant. For a person of the 16th century, they were images of plague and fires. For the inhabitants of the 19th century, earthquakes and cholera epidemics. For people of the 21st century, pandemics and global catastrophes. It is the universality of these images that makes Nostradamus's prophecies eternal. Each new crisis, each tragedy, seems to breathe life into his lines. People find a reflection of their fears in them again and again and begin to believe that all of this was predicted in advance. But if one looks from a rational perspective, it is clear that he did not foresee specific dates and places. He spoke of things that were and always will be, the disasters that have accompanied humanity since the beginning. Fire, water, diseases, wars, these became the building blocks of his prophecies, and this is why they will always seem prophetic to us. The modern world, 20th and 21st century interpretations. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Nostradamus's quatrains found new life. His texts began to be read not only as a curious legacy of the Renaissance, but as if they were direct references to the greatest tragedies and pivotal events of modern times. Let us start with World War II. Never before were Nostradamus's prophecies quoted so often as during the years of fighting against Nazi Germany. In the quatrains, people found lines about a great leader from the depths of Europe, about armies of iron that would come from the east, and about a man whose name sounded like Hister. The resemblance to Hitler's surname seemed too strong to be a coincidence. And although historians reminded people that Hister was the ancient Latin name for the Danube, In the minds of 20th century people, this image became firmly linked to the German dictator. As the Wehrmacht conquered country after country, Nostradamus's prophecies were even spread by the Allies. British intelligence used the quatrains in propaganda leaflets to show that Hitler's downfall had been foretold. Millions of soldiers and civilians found solace in this. In a world of chaos and violence, people sought some kind of support, and Nostradamus's words became for them a confirmation that history was moving toward a predicted end. After the war, interest in the prophecies did not fade, but only intensified. In 1945, the world faced the power of atomic weapons for the first time. Lines were immediately found in the quatrains about two cities that would be struck by the sun, stronger than any fire, and about a new weapon of unseen power that would bring disease and death. These lines were interpreted as a prediction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The images of the destroyed Japanese cities, where only ruins and radioactive shadows on the walls remained after the bombs, so shocked humanity that it turned to Nostradamus again. His words about a new source of disease, invisible to the eye, seemed to be a hint of radiation, which cannot be felt immediately but kills slowly. Interpreters said, "Here is proof that he foresaw the birth of the atomic age." Skeptics countered that the lines were too general and could have meant anything. But in the public consciousness, the connection became fixed. 20 years later, in 1963, America experienced another shock, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The country was in a state of optimism. Kennedy embodied hope and renewal. His death in Dallas shook the whole world. And once again, lines were found in Nostradamus's quatrains that seemed to point directly to this event. They spoke of a great sovereign who would fall from a sudden blow during a festivity in front of the people. Everything matched: the ceremonial motorcade, the public celebration, the sudden shot, the crowd of witnesses. Interpreters claimed that Nostradamus had seen this tragedy. Skeptics, however, noted that there have been many assassination attempts on rulers throughout history and that such words could be applied to other cases. But for millions of Americans, the coincidence was obvious. An even stronger resurgence of interest in the prophecies came in the early 21st century after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. On that day, Al-Qaeda terrorists crashed passenger planes into the World Trade Center towers in New York. The world froze in horror as the skyscrapers collapsed, burying thousands of people. Almost immediately, quotes allegedly belonging to Nostradamus began to appear in newspapers and on the internet. One of the most popular was the phrase, "In the 9th month of the year, 2 steel birds will strike the towers, and in the great city, a flame will rise." This line spread all over the world, and millions believed it had truly been written in the 16th century. In fact, it was a later forgery created after the attack. But the fact that people immediately connected the tragedy to Nostradamus speaks for itself. His name had become synonymous with the prediction of disaster. Nevertheless, images that seemed to resonate with the events were found in the genuine quatrains as well. Some lines spoke of a great northern city engulfed in flames and of 2 great columns that would fall in smoke. These words came to be seen as a direct reference to the Twin Towers. Thus, in the 20th and 21st centuries, Nostradamus's prophecies were given new life. Every great upheaval, every tragedy, made people open his book anew. In his lines, they saw war, atomic fire, the deaths of presidents, and the fall of towers. For some, this was proof of his foresight. For others, an example of how easily ambiguous images can be fitted to any event. This is the riddle of Nostradamus. His texts are like an eternal mirror in which each generation sees its own misfortunes. For the 16th century, it was the plague and religious wars. For the 20th century, world wars and the atomic bomb. For the 21st century, terrorist attacks and pandemics. His quatrains endure because they are written in the language of universal fears that do not grow old. Unfulfilled prophecies and the human psyche. When people talk about Nostradamus, they usually remember only the quatrains that supposedly came true. But if one looks at his entire body of work, it becomes clear that the vast majority of his lines have never found real confirmation. Many prophecies, especially those that contained more specific hints of dates or events, remained unfulfilled. And this is a very important point that is often not mentioned. The centuries contain lines where specific dates and even years are mentioned. Nostradamus's contemporaries anxiously awaited these deadlines, but none of what was predicted occurred. In the very next generation, people began to say that the dates must be understood symbolically, that perhaps it was a different time that was being referenced. Thus began the tradition of flexible interpretations. If a prophecy did not come true, it meant it was either still in the future or it needed to be understood differently. A special place is held by the quatrains about the end of the world. Nostradamus wrote about a great end, the destruction of the world, and the last judgment. In the 16th century, people were convinced that the end of the world would come in 1666. The number seemed especially ominous, a millennium plus the number of the beast, 666. When nothing happened, the predictions were moved to the 17th century. Later, the quatrains were interpreted to mean that the apocalypse would occur in 1792, then in 1844, and later in 1999. In the 21st century, when the whole world was discussing the Mayan calendar and the year 2012, many people again opened Nostradamus and insisted that he had predicted that date. Each time, expectations were not met, but this did not destroy faith in the prophet. It only gave rise to new interpretations. The same thing happened with quatrains about rulers. Some lines spoke of the death of monarchs, others of the fall of dynasties. But most often, the prophecies were too general. In one era, they were applied to a French king, in another to an English one, and in a third to an Italian duke. If an event did not match, the prophecy was shifted to the next ruler. A particularly striking example is the legend of the three Antichrists. The word Antichrist does appear in the quatrains, and interpreters decided that it referred to three villains who would appear in the world one after another. In the 19th century, Napoleon was called the first Antichrist, and in the 20th, Hitler was called the second. But with the third, things became more complicated. Some considered Stalin to be the third, others Mao, and still others Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden. But the prophecy never came true. The text of the quatrain is so vague that any name can be inserted into it. Memory of prophecies is selective. People tend to remember coincidences and forget mistakes. If a quatrain seems to have come true, it is reprinted, cited, and discussed. If it has not been fulfilled, people simply stop talking about it. This creates the illusion that Nostradamus was an infallible prophet. Sometimes, the lines were too vague to be linked to a specific event. But this also worked in favor of the legend. Such quatrains continued to await their moment. Interpreters claimed that the prediction was still to come. And when a new disaster occurred, a corresponding text was immediately found. Sometimes, direct forgers got involved. If an event was too big to have a mention in the quatrains, it would be added to Nostradamus's legacy. For example, after September 11, 2001, lines about two steel birds that would crash into the towers spread around the world. This quatrain was never written by Nostradamus, but millions of people believed in its authenticity. And it was these forgeries that only strengthened the belief that he had predicted everything. Unfulfilled prophecies are not a weakness of Nostradamus's image, but on the contrary, part of his strength. His texts are written so ambiguously that, if one so desires, they can be seen as a reflection of any event. If a quatrain came true, it proved his prophetic gift. If it did not, it means that we misunderstood it, or the event is still in the future. It is this very ambiguity that has made his prophecies eternal and him the most famous prophet in history. When we reflect on the phenomenon of Nostradamus, we inevitably face the question of why people so willingly believe in his prophecies. After all, if we analyze his texts carefully, it becomes obvious that they are full of vague images, ambiguous expressions, and symbols that can be interpreted in dozens of ways. And yet, for 5 centuries, his name has remained a symbol of predicting the future. The main answer lies in human psychology. Humans are inclined to seek predictability. Uncertainty frightens us most of all. When we think about tomorrow, about the fate of our country, about possible disasters, we are filled with anxiety. We do not know what will happen. Prophecies alleviate this anxiety. They create the illusion of order. Even if the future is terrible, if it has been predicted in advance, it means that there is a purpose in the world and that everything does not happen by chance. Furthermore, predictions provide solace. If a misfortune has befallen a nation or an individual, the thought that it was written in advance makes the experience easier to bear. This is similar to a belief in fate. If everything is predetermined, then we are not to blame and cannot change the course of events. And if we cannot change them, then all that remains is to accept them. This thought becomes a form of psychological protection for many. The Barnum effect is a psychological mechanism that is very clearly manifested in Nostradamus's quatrains. Its essence is that people perceive general and vague descriptions as being individually accurate. For example, if you say, "Sometimes you strive for success, but you often doubt yourself," most people will see themselves in this description. The quatrains work in the same way. They are built from universal images: wars, fire, blood, the fall of the great, the destruction of cities, diseases. Such images are always relevant because humanity is constantly facing these calamities. This explains the surprising longevity of the prophecies. One quatrain can describe the fire of London, the fall of the Twin Towers, or any other disaster, because it has no rigid connection. When people read, "A city will be engulfed in a great fire," they see the London of 1666. Later, in the same lines, someone else will see Hiroshima, and another person will see modern fires. If you give the same quatrain to 3 researchers, each will interpret it in their own way. One will say, "This describes 16th century France and the wars between Catholics and Huguenots." Another will see the 18th century revolution in the same lines. A third will find hints of the world wars of the 20th century. And all 3 will be convinced that they are right. This phenomenon makes the quatrains like a mirror. They reflect not the future, but the expectations and fears of the reader. This is how the impression of prophecy is created. After all, we see in the text not what Nostradamus wrote, but what has already happened to us. History fits itself to the prophecy, not the other way around. Another important feature of the human psyche comes into play here: selective memory. We remember coincidences and forget mistakes. If a quatrain seems to have come true, it is reprinted, cited, and discussed. If it turned out to be wrong, people simply stop talking about it. Thus, the illusion that Nostradamus is always right is cemented in our memory. Let us add one more point: the desire for mystery. People love to solve riddles. Nostradamus's quatrains are structured so that every reader feels like a researcher, uncovering a hidden meaning. This in itself is fascinating, as if we are connecting with a secret left by a sage of the past. All of this together explains why the quatrains continue to live on. Their power is not that they predict specific events, but that they satisfy human psychological needs for knowledge, for solace, for a sense of purpose, and for playing with mystery. This is why Nostradamus became a symbol of prophecy. His texts are perfectly tailored to human psychology. They give us what we want to receive, even if, in reality, they contain no direct predictions. And every time the world faces a new misfortune, people open the centuries and find words that sound as if they were written specifically for their time.